Good evening and a very warm welcome to First Issues. Weeks of speculation have been followed by days of analysis and opinion after the reading of the 2015 budget speech delivered to the National Assembly last Monday. Reviews have been mixed. Proponents, the likes of Unity Dao and Sida's Tawatamane, labeling it as comprehensive, illuminating and progressive. Criticisms of a lack of detail, timelines, follow-ups and implementation abound as well. No discussions were more comprehensive, however, than those held by the illustrious assembly of industry players at the annual FNB Budget Review Seminar held right here at the GICC this very time last week. An event aptly opened by the Acting Chief Executive Officer of FNB Botswana, Richard Wright.
I'm pleased to inform you that the First National Bank Budget Review Seminar is celebrating its 21st birthday tonight. The seminar has come of age. It has been a journey wherein the bank has created a window and an opportunity for the wider business community to interrogate the national budget speech delivered by the Minister of Finance and Development Planning. The budget review session are meant to help us gain an insight and understanding of the budget proposals that are presented to Parliament. These proposals are a good indication of the macroeconomic environment within which we as the businesses are going to operate in during the year. We all listened with keen interest to the Minister's presentation of these proposals. But for an in-depth analysis, First National Bank always deems it appropriate to put together a panel of experts to help us navigate the maze and figures and policy projections which the government puts across.
This evening, we have the great pleasure of including you, the viewer, in this very necessary conversation, having had a chance to speak to members from the seminar's panel individually on the broader issues raised by the 2015 budget speech. Contributors such as Bokim President Letamusie Nyane, First National Bank Chief Economist Sizwe Ngcedlana, and PricewaterhouseCoopers Audit Partner Rudy Binedal. By now, you may think you have heard it all, but our guest's insight is truly priceless. So get comfortable and ready yourself for an eye-opening show. Welcome back to the show as we delve deep into the issues and themes raised in the 2015 budget speech. To get an understanding as to the global economic climate that the national budget was drafted in, there are few less qualified than FNB Chief Economist Sizwe Ngcedlana.
Over the last 4 years, economists have started the year forecasting an improvement in global economic activity, only to be disappointed by the actual outcomes and be forced to revise their growth expectations down. I think that there are a lot of issues that are ailing or influencing this very weak global recovery, but the two critical ones are this concept of secular stagnation, which means ultimately that there's insufficient demand for global output, which leads to weak growth, and also a high level of indebtedness, which is also constraining global economic activity.
What can we anticipate heading into the 2015-2016 financial year itself? What elements are at play?
We have to separate the outlook by region. So, for example, starting with developed markets, there does seem to be an acceleration in the US economy, and that's driven by less austerity, or the need for less austerity in the US, firstly, and the manner in which the US Central Bank has firstly reduced interest rates to zero, and then also fixed the liquidity issues and the solvency issues of the US banking system by increasing liquidity via its asset purchase program. So I think the combination of those factors is leading to an acceleration in US economic activity. We are seeing similar improvements in the UK economy. However, with respect to Europe and Japan, economic activity there is still soft. There are risks of deflation within those economies, In other words, inflation actually becoming negative on a sustained basis. And the other issue there, or the implication of all this, is that the Central Bank of Europe and the Bank of Japan is having to embark on an accelerated easing of monetary policy there. If we think about emerging markets, I think the emerging market outlook is somewhat weak, given the fact that a lot of emerging market economies firstly export to the Eurozone, and also given the fact that a lot of them are commodity exporters. And we have seen massive decline in commodity prices across the board, so be it base metals, and of late the significant decline in the oil price. So I think on balance, you're seeing a divergence in global growth, with countries like the US and the UK likely to outperform, countries like Japan and the Eurozone likely to underperform, and as a bloc, emerging markets also likely to underperform because of the significant declines or significant moderation in commodity prices.
Caesar says the Chinese slowdown and its effect on commodity prices is but one of the global themes to affect sub-Saharan Africa this year.
With respect to the outlook for sub-Saharan Africa, I think China is clearly, or has been, a key driver. The fact that China has been growing as strong as it has over the last 20 to 30 years, and the fact that that growth has been very commodity intensive, has meant that sub-Saharan African countries that export commodities have benefited significantly. That commodity super cycle has also brought in a lot of income into sub-Saharan African countries and increased the tendency of these countries to diversify, or funded the diversification of these countries away from being monoline or one product only commodity exporters. The problem with China now is, and we have to take this back to 2008, when the global financial crisis hit, China was able to get out of it by accelerating credit extension. So Chinese policymakers were able to provide a lot of credit into the Chinese economy, which shielded that economy from the massive slowdown that was brought about by the global financial crisis. But the issue in China now is that credit extension and debt has increased by 80 percentage points over the last 4 years, which is a quicker debt buildup than what occurred in the US and in the Eurozone in the period leading up to the global financial crisis. So the Chinese authorities are now having to unwind or slow down this massive debt buildup. And in so doing, it means that the Chinese economy, by definition, was likely to slow down. At the same time, the Chinese authorities are also trying to switch the Chinese economy from being investment and export driven, which is commodity intensive, to being a more consumer and service led economy. So now the combination of them trying to rein in the buildup of debt and switch the emphasis of economic growth away from investments and exports towards services and consumer spending means that their growth is firstly going to be slower, and secondly less commodity intensive, which then implies that the commodity super cycle that Africa has benefited from is going to be a constraint rather than a boost to African economic activity going forward. Now, the issue for Africa is that a lot of African countries are entering this turn or this downturn in the commodity super cycle with large twin deficits, which means that governments have been living beyond their means in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, and also these countries have been living beyond their means by importing more than the export. So I think you're going to be seeing a lot of downward revisions of African economic growth for sub-Saharan Africa as a bloc over the course of 2015 and 2016. The last point I'd like to make, however, is I think that in terms of the funding of these deficits, because you are seeing monetary policy in advanced economies remaining easy, or in some jurisdictions like Europe and Japan being aggressively eased, that the funding of these deficits is likely to remain sustained until that situation reverses, until monetary policy tightens in advanced economies.
Welcome back to the show. As next we hear what the private sector representative residing in these offices behind me has to say about the 2015 budget speech. In the presentation of the 2015 national budget, Minister Kenneth Matamba pointed to the role of government in promoting growth in the country as a facilitatory one, through which the provision of a conducive environment for efficient operations of the private sector is created. As far as Bokem is concerned, how well has the government facilitated a good business environment?
Very little has been achieved in terms of creating a conducive environment. A conducive environment relates to removing bottlenecks, in particular bureaucratic bottlenecks to doing business. We all know how Botswana is performing in the doing business index, that Botswana is not doing very well. It's a known fact. We're doing quite a lot of work between government and ourselves, the private sector, to try and remove those hurdles. Majority of the bottlenecks are bureaucratic. Policies are great. If you look at the budget speech, for instance, the aspirations are very good. We all understand what the government is saying. We concur on quite a lot of things, including that the economy should be driven by the private sector in terms of implementation and so on. However, when it comes to implementation, government agrees and in some cases take forever to create policies. I'll give an example. For instance, the policy on tourism that was started in 2008 has only been implemented in January this year. These are some of the bottlenecks. It's implementation by government. It's removing agreed removal of certain bureaucratic hurdles that we are agreed, but they never really get removed. That is implementation.
What could have been done to facilitate earlier implementation?
I think it takes commitment, government commitment, because as the private sector, when we talk about facilitation, and let me say this, I often hear expressions about the private sector's slowness in doing what it should do to implement projects. The truth of the matter is every project must be managed and facilitated, and that is the role of government. Government does the project management of all the projects in terms of implementation. And in the budget speech, the minister indicated that they are only now starting programs to educate or to train the government counterparts, which is the project managers and so on. I can assure you that most of the failures in the major government projects, they fail because the projects are not managed or managed well at all. Wrong decisions are made, and these decisions could be decisions of technical implementation, could be decisions of spending money in the relevant right places at the right time. Spending money at the right time for relevant purposes. And when this happens, the project progress can be thrown through the window immediately.
During the budget presentation, parastatals such as the Botswana Telecommunications Corporation Limited, Botswana Meat Commission, the National Development Bank, Botswana Housing Corporation and Bokra were listed as having performed satisfactorily.
BTC Limited recorded a net profit of 273.6 million in 2013, compared to a net profit of 236.9 million in 2012, an improvement. And this was due to growth in revenue as a result of increased customer base, especially in the mobile business sector. NDB registered a net profit of 45.8 million pula in 2013 compared to 40.6 million pula in 2012. I understand due to initiatives such as Ntlatosa Kumuraki initiative by NDB, which I understand continues to attract customers. With continued demand for services due to the significant growth in the use of mobile internet technology, particularly smartphones, Bokra recorded a net profit of 40.6 million in 2013 compared to 31.2 million in 2012.
Our guest, however, is not impressed by their performance, and he explains why.
The parastatals that have been set as government private sector have been set for a purpose, which is to deliver services to the people of Botswana. It puzzles me that when it comes to the return on investment, which is the investment the government puts into these parastatals, it seems like we are only looking at profit. And there's no mention of what it is these parastatals are set for and whether they have delivered the services to the people. I do not believe that the government's purpose is only to make profit. The government should be looking at return on its investment, and it must define right up front what that return should be in terms of delivery of service to the people. Look at this. For a Motswana out there, is interested to know how long it takes to connect the telephone, how long it takes for him to access electricity or connect electricity to his house, how long it takes for judiciary to attend to his case, and so on.
Another venture that was featured in the 2015 budget speech is the Public Services Outsourcing Program, through which the government currently outsources grounds maintenance, security guarding, and cleaning services. Could this be enough to excite the private sector and potential entrepreneurs?
I would like to concur with the minister that if we are going to diversify this economy, if we are going to grow this economy, if we are going to create jobs, if we are going to create wealth for Botswana, we need to involve the private sector in undertaking some of the major developments in this country. Let me say this. CTO. Government is not doing a good job in terms of transportation in this country. Give that to the private sector. Air Botswana, the running of airports, running of our schools, education and so on. There are lots of aspects where government could hands off, involve itself in issues of oversight and regulations and policy making and so on, and allow the private sector to grow. Often we say our private sector is not big enough or sophisticated enough. Hey, private sector size and sophistication has a direct bearing on what it's thrown at it. If you throw peanuts to us, you will create the private sector of monkeys.
Next on the program, we speak to yet another industry player who found the national budget speech to be, as he says, devoid of detail. Welcome back to the show. Behind me is where we had a discussion with audit partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Rudy Binadel, on the tax implications of the 2015 budget speech. Nothing at all was said on tax in the speech, yet we managed to have a very illuminating conversation with our tax expert. This is our conversation. Why was nothing said at all about tax in yesterday's budget speech?
Very difficult question to answer, and most probably one that the minister is best to answer. But if I am allowed to, I would guess. I'll take a few guesses. The first is that the changes to the legislation that were announced in last year's budget speech were only implemented this year on the 23rd of January. They were passed in Parliament in December 2014, but only implemented on the 23rd of January this year. And also not exactly as we had expected from the budget speech, implemented a bit differently, which I find ironic that it takes us almost a year. But I think that maybe the shock of it only being implemented so shortly before budget means let's not have further changes. I think a second reason is that government, the minister, felt that he was comfortable with inflation. Inflation will always help you increase your tax base, and most probably that allowed him to say, I can give a little bit of respite to the taxpayer. We must also recognize that something that is in government's arsenal, and I realize that when we talk about Air Botswana, Botswana Power Corporation, etc., which the minister mentioned, parastatals don't always sound like self-financing organizations. But there are a number of new parastatals on the map. Bokra, Bofinet, Mbafira to a certain extent, and all of those parastatals have been told you will be self-financing. So to a certain degree, there are hidden taxes coming into our system where the minister doesn't need to find finance from the tax base to finance those activities anymore, because they are charging fees to those that they are servicing, and they have to operate commercially. The minister is not interested in handing out subsidies to those enterprises. And then lastly, I think that what has happened with the tax changes that came through last year, for example, with the threshold for VAT registration having moved up, a lot of administrative burden may be relieved within BERS. And that capacity will be used for greater enforcement. And I think that it's more in the how will the minister ensure that after the current legislation, he maximizes income. And I think that the trick there lies in the enforcement, and that we may very well see more enforcement coming through.
You said that the changes that were announced last year were not identical to what was implemented this year. Could you please, expand on that?
The one change in particular that was announced last year was an exemption of certain basic foodstuffs. And there's a difference in VAT legislation between exempt and zero. For the consumer, we all pay zero VAT, whether it's exempt or zero rated. However, for the person selling, there's a big distinction between exemption and zero rating, in that the person selling the goods, if it is an exempt sale, cannot claim input VAT. And therefore, the minister announced that these basic foodstuffs would be exempt from value-added tax last year in his budget speech. The final legislation, when it came out Friday, about a week ago, says that these foodstuffs are now zero rated, which means that those selling it can still claim the input VAT, and therefore the true saving to the consumer should really be the 12% VAT that is on top of those fresh fruits and vegetables, milk, bread, flour, etc. The exemption on tractors, specifically tractors, that has remained an exemption. It didn't go to zero rating.
We have left you with quite a bit to mull over, and look forward to hearing your input across our various social media platforms. Until next week and yet another very informative show, I, Namitso Semakula, the team behind First Issues, and our sponsors, First National Bank, bid you good night. Enjoy the rest of the evening's programming.